USA, and it covers 3 vehicles really from the 60s that are key vehicles in the, or were in the US Army. The first is the M60A1, which was about their equivalent of Chieftain. It's armed with the British 105mm gun, but like most American tanks at that time, it's built almost entirely from castings. A large cast turret, a cast hull. They usually feature the Continental diesel, automatic transmission, and horizontal torsion bar suspension. Usually with a separate component commander, which had its own machine gun in it, and enabled him to. You probably won't hear us very well while the engine of everything is roaring, but it's an impressive sound and well worth soaking up on its own.
The M60s following on really a whole series of American tanks, the Patton tanks as we called them after the Second World War. In a sense, the Americans just upgraded and built larger versions of their own original designs. So the M48 tank came into service just after World War II. The M60, they started upgrading it, they started designing it in the 50s. It does go into service actually in 1960, and again, you may recognise this because, of course, a lot of countries have got it all around the world. It was sold on to 15,000 made, so there's an awful lot of them. And they were sold on and passed off by the US government. And at the moment, there's M60s all along the border of Turkey, keeping an eye on the Syrian border there. So still they appear on the news a lot.
Well, I think the secret was it was a very serviceable tank, which is why it's still used in such a large number. Very reliable and quite tough. Next vehicle there. It's a self-propelled gun. It's on a special 25-ton low-profile chassis. The whole gun mounted set above it, so it's unlike the usual self-propelled gun. You have a superstructure. This has none at all. It's got an earth anchor at the back, which is hinged and folds down to dig into the ground when the gun fires to stop it leaping backwards. Powered by a Continental engine at the front. The driver sitting below the engine deck alongside it, and with large diameter rope wheels. Again, sprung on torsion bar suspension.
This gun that's on the top there, an 8-inch gun, that could, or roughly about 203mm. This particular version, they put a muzzle brake on the end. If you look on the end of the barrel, that's to help dissipate some of the force and lessen the recoil. But on a full charge, that gun could fire around from here to about 30 kilometres away. So quite a sizable gun there, as you can see. Self-propelled artillery, not really part of our sort of collecting policy here, but it's good to see it because it's an example of what's not a tank really. It's a chassis that's used to move an artillery piece around the battlefield. One version of this in British Army service actually was tested to fire nuclear shells on the European battlefield, so that could fire potentially a nuclear shell in a tactical situation. The other vehicle, by the way, that would go around, you've seen earlier, our rides vehicle that was taking people for rides, that would be the vehicle that would accompany the N110, carrying all the ammunition for it into battle.
Now we've got, this is really something of a treat for you. It's an M103, one of the biggest of the American tanks, and very similar to the British Conqueror. Carried the same gun, although being American, it was built on a scale-up version of the M60 chassis, Continental diesel engine, automatic transmission. Being made much more mobile. Which is why it's in such a large turret. This version, which is the M103A1E1, they were used by the United States Marine Corps. The Army decided they were too big for them, didn't want them, and gave them away. So the Marines gladly took them. And what use they are for amphibious operations these days, you can well ask yourself. It's a huge turret, And the people inside it usually get lost if they're not careful. The commander's so far at the back he's out of touch with everybody. But that gun is an amazing size in there. And with the hitting power of 120 mil, which is really no more than Chieftain and Challenger carry today. But in those days it was fired separate shell and brass case ammunition. So it had to be loaded by either two people or one person working one thing at a time, projectile and then the case, and then firing them and disposing of the case, which was a problem in itself.
Just the idea behind the M103 and the British Conqueror tanks, they thought we'd need a super heavy tank that would act in what would now be called an overwatch position. Our normal tanks, the Centurions, the M48s, the M60s would be in the foreground. These whoppers would be behind, hopefully picking off Soviet tanks before they got in range. That was the idea. But with the Conqueror, we replaced with the Centurion and then the Chieftain, and with the M103, they just didn't really like the idea in the US Army after about a certain time, so they went for the Universal or the main battle tank instead. And it was also a hugely expensive tank. Back in 1954, one of these M103 tanks, because they were so big and complex, cost even back then $300,000, and that was a lot of money then. So not that many were built, and the Army passed them on to the US Marines, as David said, quite quickly, and they came out of service. And the last ones were in service in about 1972. We actually had one of the crew members, a US Marine of our particular tank, visited us a couple of years ago, and he pointed out in the turret where he'd scratched his name inside that massive great turret there, you can see.